Princess Auralyne Emberfell stood beneath the glass canopy of her private observatory, watching a silver diplomatic vessel descend through the violet clouds of Velmara Prime. Her orange fur caught the pale morning light, glowing like fire along her cheeks, throat, and the elegant line of her vulpine ears. Her tail moved once behind her, slow and irritated. Another delegation, another ceremony, another group of polished strangers pretending they had come for peace while quietly measuring her as if she were a crown jewel behind glass. "Your Highness," said Miri, her lifelong attendant, stepping softly onto the balcony. "The Solari envoy has entered the landing court." Auralyne did not turn. "How many of them are unmarried?" Miri hesitated. Auralyne gave a dry laugh. "That many? 3 officially, 1 unofficially, 1 classified as emotionally unavailable, which appears to be a human diplomatic category. At least humans are creative liars." Miri's mouth twitched. "There is also a late addition. A civilian advocate, no noble rank, no military record. His file is thin." That made Auralyne's ears tilt. A thin file meant one of 2 things. Someone unimportant, or someone important enough to be hidden. "What is his name?" "Jonah Vale." Auralyne repeated it quietly. "And what does a civilian advocate do?" "Apparently, he ensures treaties do not harm ordinary people." For the first time all morning, Auralyne turned. "Ordinary people?" she asked. "Yes, Highness." "In diplomacy?" "So it says." Auralyne looked back down at the landing court as the human delegation emerged beneath banners of crystal and flame. Her mother would expect her to smile. The court would expect her to behave. The nobles would expect her to endure. But 3 years ago, before the entire empire, Auralyne had sworn the Ember Vow. She would never marry. Not for bloodlines. Not for treaties. Not for peace. Not to make powerful men feel chosen. She had meant every word. And yet, as the humans crossed the court, one man at the back stopped walking, left the formation, and helped a servant gather scattered ceremonial scrolls from the wind. The whole court froze. The man smiled at the terrified servant like she mattered. Auralyne's tail went still. "Oh," she murmured. Miri followed her gaze. "That must be Jonah Vale." Auralyne watched him return to the delegation, completely unaware he had just offended half the empire by being kind. "How inconvenient," she said. The greeting hall of Velmara Prime had been built to intimidate. Its ceiling rose so high that clouds gathered beneath the crystal arches. The floor was black starstone veined with gold. Along the walls stood statues of every Ember sovereign who had expanded the throne's reach across 12 systems. Auralyne hated the room. It was beautiful, yes. But it was the kind of beauty that demanded silence from everyone standing beneath it. Her mother, Empress Seraphine Emberfell, sat upon the high throne with the stillness of a blade. Auralyne stood at her right side. Not as daughter, as symbol, as heir, as prize. The Solari delegation bowed with careful respect. Ambassador Ren Calloway spoke first, offering polished words about cooperation, resource exchange, cultural understanding, and shared futures. Auralyne barely listened. Her eyes kept drifting to Jonah Vale. He was not the tallest human in the room. Not the most decorated. Not the most refined. His coat sat slightly crooked, as if formal clothing had personally offended him. While the others faced the throne, Jonah kept noticing everyone else. A guard shifting weight on a sore leg. A young page trembling while holding a tray. A cleaning worker trying to disappear behind a pillar. Then, during the ambassador's speech, one of the hanging flame banners slipped from its hook. The page beneath it panicked. Jonah moved before anyone else even reacted. He crossed the sacred center line of the hall, caught the falling banner, and helped the page secure it again. The nobles gasped. The ambassador stopped speaking. The page looked ready to faint. Jonah whispered something. The page laughed. Auralyne stared. No one made servants laugh in the greeting hall. Not here. Not under the eyes of dead emperors. Jonah returned to his place and mouthed, "Sorry," to the ambassador. He did not look sorry. Auralyne had seen warriors perform bravery. She had seen princes perform charm. She had seen noble sons perform humility so badly it became arrogance in costume. But this was different. Jonah Vale had not acted for attention. He had forgotten attention existed. After the ceremony, while the delegation was escorted away, Auralyne watched him fall behind again. This time, he stopped to ask an elderly palace guard about the carvings on her spear. The guard answered, then kept answering, then smiled. Auralyne leaned toward Miri. He is either very stupid, she said softly, or very dangerous. Miri watched Jonah thank the guard with genuine warmth. Perhaps both, Highness. Auralyne's ears flicked. For the first time in years, she wanted to know more. By the third day, Jonah Vale had become a problem. Not officially. Officially, he was harmless. A civilian advocate, a minor voice attached to a major delegation. No title, no command authority, no royal blood, no fleet behind him. And officially, half the palace was talking about him. He had asked kitchen workers whether they were paid fairly. He had asked dock laborers whether imperial contracts improved their lives or simply raised quotas. He had asked teachers from annexed moons whether their children were allowed to study their native histories. Worst of all, people answered him. That was what frightened the nobles. Not the questions, the answers. Auralyne heard the reports in her mother's private chamber, where the walls shimmered with living maps of the empire. He is stirring dissatisfaction, said Lord Marrow, a thin noble with silver scales along his jaw. He is listening to dissatisfaction, Auralyne corrected. Her mother's eyes shifted toward her. Auralyne lowered her gaze, but not quickly enough. Empress Seraphine dismissed the council with one sharp gesture. When they were alone, she rose from the throne. You find this amusing? No, mother. You find him amusing. Auralyne said nothing. That human is walking through my empire asking common workers if they are happy. A dangerous question. A childish question, Seraphine snapped. Empires are not built on happiness. They are built on order. Auralyne's tail curled around her ankle. Order for whom? Her mother stared at her. The room chilled. You will speak with him, Seraphine said. Find out what he wants. Redirect him. Charm him if necessary. Threaten him if you must. But stop him from turning private grievances into diplomatic leverage. Auralyne almost laughed. There it was. Even after the vow. Even after 3 years of refusing to be used as a marriage contract. Her mother still reached for her like a tool. As you command, Auralyne said. She found Jonah in the lower gardens, sitting beside a fountain with a cracked stone rim. A group of maintenance workers stood near him, speaking freely until they saw her. They scattered into bows. Jonah looked over his shoulder. Then stood. Princess. Auralyne, she said. His eyebrows rose. That's allowed? No. Then I probably shouldn't. She sat across from him. You've upset several powerful people. Jonah sighed. Yeah, that keeps happening. Do you do it on purpose? No, he said. That's the problem. Jonah had expected a lecture. Perhaps a warning. Possibly a threat wrapped in royal politeness. Instead, Princess Auralyne Emberfell sat across from him beside the fountain, her orange fur glowing beneath the afternoon sun, and looked more curious than angry. You realize most people are terrified of speaking honestly to royalty. Jonah nodded. Yes, and yet you keep asking them difficult questions. Because nobody else does. Auralyne studied him. The answer had come too quickly to be rehearsed. Most diplomats focus on trade routes, fleet access, resource agreements, she said. Jonah leaned back against the stone bench. Trade routes matter, yet, people matter more. The princess fell silent. Wind moved through flowering crystal trees surrounding the garden. I've spent years hearing nobles explain why suffering is necessary, Jonah continued. Every civilization has people who say inequality is unfortunate but unavoidable. They always seem to be the ones benefiting from it. Auralyne's ears twitched. That statement would have started a political argument with almost anyone else. With her, it only made her uncomfortable because she wasn't sure he was wrong. You speak as though you've seen this before. I have. Jonah's expression darkened. When I was young, my home colony was controlled by corporations that practically owned entire populations. The executives talked about productivity and efficiency. Families talked about hunger. The difference in wording struck her. Same reality, different perspective. One from the top, one from below. You think my empire is like that? I think parts of it might be. His honesty should have irritated her. Instead, she found herself respecting it. Nobody spoke this way around the throne. Not because they agreed, because they were afraid. You know, Jonah said suddenly, you're not what I expected. Auralyne blinked. Meaning? I expected someone colder. She laughed despite herself. That's surprisingly rude. I meant it as a compliment. Humans are very strange. We get that a lot. For a moment neither spoke. Then Jonah tilted his head. Can I ask you something? You already are. The vow. Auralyne immediately stiffened. There it was. Finally. The inevitable question. Jonah noticed her reaction and frowned. Sorry, you don't have to answer. Most people ask within 5 minutes. Most people are rude. Auralyne stared at him. You're genuinely not interested? I'm interested in why it matters to you, he said. Not whether you might change your mind. That answer hit harder than she expected. Because for 3 years nobody had asked what she felt. Only what she intended, what she would do, what she owed, what the Empire needed, what future alliances required. No one had asked about her. Until now. That conversation should have ended there. Instead, it became the first of many. Over the next 2 weeks, Auralyne found increasingly creative excuses to cross paths with Jonah Vale. Officially, she was monitoring him. Unofficially, she enjoyed talking to him. A dangerous realization. One evening they visited the western districts of the capital. No royal escort, no ceremonial clothing, just simple travel cloaks. The district overlooked the sea, where glowing tides crashed against black cliffs beneath a sky filled with distant moons. Vendors lined the streets. Children chased each other between market stalls. Music drifted through the air. Jonah seemed fascinated by everything. Not the grand monuments. Not the expensive architecture. The people. Always the people. Auralyne watched him spend 20 minutes helping an elderly merchant repair a damaged cart. Another half-hour listening to fishermen complain about shipping taxes. Then he bought food from a small family-owned stall and sat with them while they ate. No cameras, no reporters, no political gain, just genuine interest. Why? Auralyne finally asked. Jonah looked up from his meal. Why what? Why do you care so much? His answer came immediately. Because nobody deserves to feel invisible. The words struck her harder than any speech. Invisible. For a strange moment, Auralyne realized she understood exactly what he meant. People saw the princess, the heir, the future empress, the political symbol, the sacred vow, the royal bloodline, but very few saw Auralyne, the actual woman beneath those titles. Jonah did, without effort, without trying, without even realizing it, and that frightened her more than any political crisis ever had. Because she was beginning to look forward to seeing him. Beginning to miss him when he wasn't nearby. Beginning to wonder what would happen when the delegation eventually left. Those thoughts were dangerous, not because of her vow. Because they mattered. Auralyne had spent years protecting herself from disappointment. Now, somehow, a human with crooked formal clothing and terrible diplomatic instincts was slipping through every defense she'd built. She hated how easy it felt. She hated how comfortable she felt around him. Most of all, she hated that she never wanted those conversations to end. As they walked along the moonlit waterfront, Jonah pointed toward the horizon. You ever think about leaving? The question surprised her. Leaving what? Everything. Auralyne laughed. I'm the heir to an interstellar empire. So I can't exactly disappear. Maybe not. Jonah looked toward the sea. But do you ever want to? For the first time in years, she answered honestly. Sometimes. Jonah nodded. Not shocked, not judgmental, just understanding. And somehow that made the confession even more dangerous. Because understanding was becoming harder to resist. The first major argument happened 3 days later. And it changed everything. Auralyne arrived at the council chambers expecting routine discussions. Instead, she found military commanders gathered around a holographic map. Several outer systems glowed red. A bad sign. Very bad. What happened? She asked. The room went silent. Her mother stood at the center of the map. A mining coalition on Dethros has refused imperial labor directives. Auralyne frowned. Refused? They are calling it a strike. One commander snorted. They are calling it rebellion. The hologram zoomed inward. Entire settlements appeared. Factories. Worker colonies. Mining settlements. Families. Not armies. Families. Auralyne's stomach tightened. Then she noticed Jonah standing near the rear wall beside Ambassador Calloway. His expression looked grim. The commander continued. We recommend immediate deployment of enforcement fleets. To do what? Jonah asked. The room turned. The commander looked annoyed. Restore order. Meaning? Meaning remove resistance. Jonah's jaw tightened. And the civilians? The commander shrugged. If necessary. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that arrives just before something breaks. Jonah took a slow breath. Then another. Auralyne recognized the expression. He was angry. Not emotional, not reckless, angry, the controlled kind, the dangerous kind. Their grievances are legitimate, Jonah said. According to whom? Snapped one noble. According to your own economic reports. That caught attention. Several heads turned. Jonah stepped forward. I reviewed public records. Productivity quotas increased 38%. Wages remained effectively unchanged. Housing conditions declined. Local representatives filed complaints for 6 consecutive years. Nobody answered. Because he was correct. Auralyne knew it. The silence confirmed it. The commander crossed his arms. None of that justifies rebellion. No, Jonah replied. It explains it. The room exploded into argument. And Auralyne suddenly realized this crisis was about to become much larger than anyone expected. Because Jonah Vale had stopped asking questions. And started challenging answers. Which was infinitely more dangerous. The council chamber dissolved into chaos. Voices overlapped one another until the translators built into the walls struggled to keep pace. He has no authority to speak here. He is a foreign civilian. He's insulting the Empire. He is quoting our own reports. The last statement came from Auralyne. Silence swept through the room. Every eye turned toward the princess. Even Jonah looked surprised. Lord Marrow frowned. You've reviewed those reports? I review every quarterly report submitted to the crown. You believe this, human? I believe numbers. She stepped toward the holographic projection, extending a claw. The map shifted, displaying supply records from Dethros. Food imports have decreased. Another gesture. Housing maintenance budgets have been cut. Another. Medical staffing has fallen for 5 consecutive years. No one interrupted her. Because they couldn't. The information was accurate. The commander folded his arms. Hardship does not excuse rebellion. No, Auralyne replied calmly. But ignoring hardship creates one. The Empress finally spoke. Auralyne. Just her name. Nothing more. Yet everyone in the chamber knew it was a warning. The princess met her mother's gaze. If we send fleets before negotiators, every family on Dethros will believe the Empire values obedience more than justice. The Empire does value obedience. Auralyne's ears lowered. There is a difference between obedience and loyalty. No one breathed. Not the nobles. Not the guards. Not even Jonah. The Empress descended the steps of the throne. You embarrass yourself. No. Auralyne kept her voice level. I embarrass the illusion that everything is fine. The room became painfully still. Her mother stared at her for several long seconds. Then she turned toward the military commanders. The council is dismissed. Everyone bowed immediately. Only Jonah remained standing until Ambassador Calloway quietly tugged his sleeve. As the room emptied, Auralyne caught Jonah looking at her. Not proudly, not triumphantly, simply concerned. That somehow meant more. You shouldn't have done that. Jonah found her later that evening on one of the palace's highest terraces. The capital stretched beneath them like a sea of golden lights. Auralyne smiled faintly. You'll need to be more specific. In there, you think I was wrong? No. His answer came immediately. I think you just made your life much harder. She laughed softly. It was already difficult. Jonah leaned against the balcony railing. I've seen governments punish people for less. So have I? Then why? Auralyne looked across the skyline. When I was little, my father used to sneak me into the lower districts. Jonah looked surprised. You had a different emperor? My father wasn't emperor. A smile crossed her face. He was simply my father. She could almost remember the warmth of his hand. He believed rulers should know the names of the people they ruled. What happened? He died. The words came quietly. After that, she looked back toward the palace. Everyone began teaching me how to become an heir instead of how to remain myself. Jonah didn't interrupt, didn't offer sympathy. He simply listened. It becomes easy, she continued, to mistake reports for reality. He nodded slowly. That's why I talk to people. I know. I don't distrust governments because they're governments. He looked toward the city. I distrust distance. The sentence lingered between them. Distance. That was exactly what had happened. Distance between rulers and workers. Distance between nobles and citizens. Distance between mothers and daughters. Auralyne realized there was another distance shrinking. The one between herself and Jonah. She noticed it in little ways. How naturally they walked beside one another. How conversations no longer felt formal. How silence between them had become comfortable. She hadn't experienced that in years. Maybe ever. It frightened her, because comfort led to attachment, and attachment could become loss. The following morning, Jonah disappeared. Not dramatically. He simply wasn't where anyone expected him to be. Ambassador Calloway searched the diplomatic wing. The palace staff searched the gardens. Even Auralyne found herself asking servants if anyone had seen the human. Finally Miri entered her study. We found him. Where? The Western Maintenance District. Auralyne blinked. Doing what? Miri looked genuinely confused. Helping repair a collapsed school. The princess stared. He volunteered? Apparently. Within minutes she arrived outside the damaged building. Half the roof had collapsed after years of neglected maintenance. Workers climbed scaffolding. Children waited outside with stacks of books. And in the middle of everything, Jonah carried wooden support beams across his shoulder. His formal diplomatic coat had vanished. His sleeves were rolled up. Dust covered his face. He was laughing with construction workers as if he'd known them for years. One little fox child tugged on his sleeve. He crouched to her height. What happened to your classroom? He asked. The ceiling fell. Were you hurt? She shook her head. My teacher pushed everyone outside. Jonah smiled. Sounds like you've got a brave teacher. The child nodded proudly. Auralyne watched the interaction from across the street. No reporters. No nobles. No political advantage. He truly expected nothing in return. One elderly builder noticed the princess standing nearby. Everyone immediately stopped working. Jonah turned. Oh. He smiled. Morning. Auralyne crossed her arms. You vanished. I left a note. You left it under a datapad. I thought someone would find it. She sighed. You are the worst diplomat I've ever met. I've heard. He looked around at the damaged school. But I figured this mattered more than another breakfast meeting. Auralyne looked at the cracked walls. The broken desks. The children patiently waiting outside. Then back at Jonah. You know, she said quietly, you're making it very difficult for me to dislike you. Jonah laughed. I wasn't aware that was your goal. It was. And? She watched one of the workers smile as the roof beam finally slid into place. I'm beginning to think I failed. Neither of them noticed Miri watching from the opposite side of the street. The attendant folded her arms with a knowing smile. For the first time in many years, Princess Auralyne looked genuinely happy. And Miri feared exactly what that happiness might eventually cost. The school became the first place Auralyne ever visited twice without an official reason. The second time, she came alone. As alone as a crown princess could be. Miri remained several streets away with 2 discreet royal guards, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough that the children playing outside the repaired school ignored them. Jonah was kneeling beside a wooden table inside one of the classrooms, sleeves rolled to his elbows again. Instead of discussing treaties, he was helping a group of students assemble a simple star map. And that's the Solari belt, he explained, carefully placing a tiny crystal marker into the model. A young Vulpine boy frowned. It looks too small. It is. So why is it famous? Jonah grinned. Because humans have a habit of making small places very important. The room erupted in laughter. Auralyne remained unnoticed in the doorway. She watched the children swarm around him with endless questions. None of them cared that he represented another civilization. None of them cared that he advised governments. To them, he was simply someone who listened. Eventually one of the students spotted her. Princess. The room instantly became silent. Children hurried into clumsy bows. Teachers nearly tripped over themselves. Jonah looked up. Oh. His smile appeared immediately. Morning. You've become popular. He glanced around. I brought educational kits. You rebuilt half their classroom. That too. Auralyne stepped inside. The children stared at her with enormous eyes. Royalty almost never entered ordinary classrooms. She knelt beside one little girl whose orange ears drooped nervously. What are you studying? The child held up a drawing. Our families. Auralyne looked at the page. Parents, brothers, grandparents, pets, simple things. Things she barely remembered having. The little girl's tail wagged. My papa says you're going to be empress someday. Auralyne smiled softly. So I've been told. Are you nice? The classroom froze. Teachers looked ready to faint. Jonah bit the inside of his cheek, desperately trying not to laugh. Auralyne looked down at the child. I hope so. The girl thought for several seconds. I think you are. No noble had ever complimented her that honestly. It somehow meant more coming from a child. Later that afternoon, Auralyne and Jonah walked through the botanical terraces overlooking the capital. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally Jonah broke the silence. You looked happy. She looked sideways. I was. I don't think I've ever seen that expression before. You've only known me a few weeks. True, he smiled. But I think I've mostly seen Princess Auralyne. And today? I met Auralyne. She stopped walking. His words lingered. What do you mean? When you were talking with those kids. He searched for the right words. You forgot everyone was watching. Auralyne looked away. So did you. I usually do. I've noticed. Jonah laughed. I've never understood performing all the time. You've never needed to. She resumed walking. When you're born into the throne. She gestured toward the palace towering above the city. Every room becomes a stage. And when does the performance stop? She answered almost immediately. It doesn't. Jonah frowned. That sounds exhausting. It is. Another silence settled between them. Eventually Jonah asked quietly, does anyone know the real you? The question struck deeper than she expected. She considered every noble, every tutor, every commander, every advisor, even her own mother. Finally she whispered, I don't know anymore. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. I think I'm starting to. She met his eyes. There was no manipulation, no hidden motive, no attempt to flatter, just quiet certainty, for reasons she couldn't explain. That scared her. Because if he truly saw her, then he also possessed the power to hurt her. Something she had sworn years ago would never happen again. The summons from the Empress arrived before sunrise. Auralyne already knew it would not be pleasant. Her mother's private audience chamber overlooked the entire capital. The doors sealed shut behind her. No attendants, no guards, only mother and daughter. Seraphine stood beside the enormous window. You've been spending an unusual amount of time with the human. We've spoken. You've been seen rebuilding schools. I visited one. You have been seen smiling. Auralyne blinked. Is that now a crime? Her mother's expression remained unreadable. No. She turned slowly. But it is unusual. Auralyne folded her arms. What is this truly about? The nobles are asking questions. They always ask questions. They believe your attachment to Jonah Vale is clouding your judgment. Auralyne's ears flattened. My judgment? You publicly questioned military strategy. Because it deserved questioning. You have defended him repeatedly. Because he was correct. Seraphine stepped closer. And now? Her voice lowered. They are beginning to wonder whether your sacred vow is weakening. The words landed like ice. Auralyne felt anger rise immediately. My vow concerns marriage. Perception concerns everything. I have made no promises. You have formed an attachment. Silence. Auralyne wanted to deny it. She couldn't. Not honestly. The Empress saw that hesitation. I warned you years ago. You warned me about love. I warned you about vulnerability. Her mother's eyes softened for the first time. Only slightly. I watched your father die. Auralyne froze. You were too young to understand. Seraphine looked toward the distant skyline. When someone becomes the center of your heart, she whispered, the universe learns exactly where to strike. The room became painfully quiet. For the first time in years, Auralyne saw not the Empress, but a widow, a woman who had buried the only person she had ever trusted completely. I will not lose you the same way. Auralyne's voice became equally soft. You already did. The words escaped before she could stop them. Seraphine's face changed, not with anger, with pain. Auralyne immediately regretted saying it. But neither of them apologized. Neither knew how. The princess turned and quietly left the chamber. Behind her, the Empress remained standing alone before the window, watching a city she had protected for decades, while realizing she no longer knew how to protect her own daughter. The atmosphere inside the palace changed overnight. No official announcement was made. No accusations were spoken aloud. Yet Auralyne could feel the shift in every hallway she walked. Conversations stopped when she approached. Nobles lowered their voices. Servants glanced between her and Jonah whenever they happened to cross paths. Rumors moved faster than starships. By afternoon, Miri entered Auralyne's study carrying a stack of datapads. I've intercepted 3 separate reports. Auralyne sighed. I assume none are pleasant. The first claims the human has manipulated you. The second? That your vow was merely a political performance. And the third? Miri hesitated. That the Solari coalition deliberately sent Jonah because they knew an unmarried heir would be emotionally vulnerable. Auralyne laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. They think this is espionage? They think powerful people never act without strategy. And kindness? Miri smiled sadly. Many of them have forgotten kindness exists. Auralyne looked toward the palace gardens below. Jonah was there again, speaking with gardeners. Of course he was. She doubted he even knew half the rumors surrounding him. That was one of the things she admired most. He wasn't playing the game. He barely realized there was one. Jonah finally noticed something was wrong during dinner. Not because anyone confronted him. Because no one would sit near him anymore. The grand banquet hall usually buzzed with diplomatic conversation. Tonight, entire tables subtly rearranged themselves. Nobles who had spoken warmly to him days earlier suddenly found reasons to speak elsewhere. One ambassador abruptly remembered another meeting. 2 military officers excused themselves before dessert. Jonah quietly watched it happen. Then looked toward Ambassador Calloway. Did I do something? She sighed. You became politically inconvenient. I fixed a school. You also questioned an empire. I questioned decisions. Governments rarely appreciate the distinction. Jonah rubbed the back of his neck. Oh. Several moments passed. Then, Auralyne crossed the room. Every conversation stopped. She ignored them. Ignored every pair of eyes following her. Ignored every whispered assumption. She simply sat beside Jonah. The silence became almost comical. Jonah leaned closer. I think everyone's staring. They are. You probably shouldn't be sitting here. I know. You'll make things worse. She reached for her glass. They were already worse. Jonah studied her expression. You look tired. I am. I'm sorry. She looked at him. For what? I think I accidentally made your life complicated. Auralyne smiled faintly. You overestimate yourself. I do? My life was complicated long before you arrived. She paused. You merely made me notice it. The orchestra continued playing. No one else spoke loudly enough to interrupt them. For the first time in years, Auralyne stopped caring who was watching. 3 days later, the delegation prepared to leave. The realization hit Auralyne much harder than she expected. She stood on the eastern balcony watching workers load diplomatic cargo aboard the silver Solari vessel. Miri approached quietly. They depart at sunset. I know. You've been standing here for an hour. I know. You could go speak with him. I know. So why haven't you? Auralyne closed her eyes. Because if I do. She couldn't finish. Miri understood anyway. Leaving became real once people said goodbye. As long as she avoided that conversation, some irrational part of her could pretend nothing was ending. Eventually Miri spoke again. Highness. Auralyne looked up. I have known you since you were 4. I know. You've never feared battle. No. You've never feared politics. No. You've never feared standing against your mother. No. Miri smiled gently. But you're terrified of one honest conversation. Auralyne gave a defeated laugh. When did you become so wise? I've simply watched you long enough. She placed a comforting hand on the princess's shoulder. The hardest battles rarely involve swords. Jonah stood alone near the diplomatic landing platform. Most of the cargo had already been loaded. Only a few hours remained before departure. He heard footsteps behind him. I was beginning to think you'd avoid me. Auralyne stopped beside him. I considered it. What changed your mind? Miri. He laughed. I like her. So do I. Neither spoke for several moments. The setting sun painted the clouds gold. Jonah finally broke the silence. I guess this is goodbye. I suppose it is. He looked out toward the horizon. I don't know when, or if, the coalition will send another delegation. Auralyne nodded slowly. I understand. Another silence. Longer this time. Jonah inhaled. I keep trying to think of something important to say. So do I. But everything sounds either too formal. He smiled awkwardly. Or completely inadequate. Auralyne looked down at her hands. I've spent years preparing speeches. And? They're useless. Jonah laughed softly. That's comforting. It shouldn't be. No. He turned toward her. You change. She blinked. I don't mean because of me. His voice remained calm. I think you stopped pretending. Auralyne swallowed. You helped. I didn't do anything. You listened. His expression softened. I'll always listen. The words lingered between them. Neither moved. Neither seemed willing to break the moment. Finally Jonah reached into his satchel. I almost forgot. He handed her a small wooden object. She turned it over in her hands. It was carved into the shape of a fox sitting beneath a tree. Simple, handmade, beautiful in its imperfections. I made it during the trip. You carved this? I'm not very good. Auralyne smiled. I disagree. She carefully traced one tiny carved ear with her claw. No one has ever given me something they made themselves. Jonah looked genuinely surprised. Really? Everything I've ever received, she glanced toward the palace, came with expectations. This doesn't, he smiled. It's just a fox. Auralyne looked at the carving again, then quietly whispered, I think it's much more than that. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from an upper palace balcony. Empress Seraphine. Her expression revealed nothing, but inside, for the first time, she began wondering whether Jonah Vale might not be the greatest threat to the empire. Perhaps the greater threat was the possibility that he truly loved her daughter without wanting anything in return. The atmosphere inside the palace changed overnight. No official announcement was made. No accusations were spoken aloud. Yet Auralyne could feel the shift in every hallway she walked. Conversations stopped when she approached. Nobles lowered their voices. Servants glanced between her and Jonah whenever they happened to cross paths. Rumors moved faster than starships. By afternoon, Miri entered Auralyne's study carrying a stack of datapads. I've intercepted 3 separate reports. Auralyne sighed. I assume none are pleasant. The first claims the human has manipulated you. The second, that your vow was merely a political performance. And the third, Miri hesitated, that the Solari coalition deliberately sent Jonah because they knew an unmarried heir would be emotionally vulnerable. Auralyne laughed, not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. They think this is espionage? They think powerful people never act without strategy. And kindness? Miri smiled sadly. Many of them have forgotten kindness exists. Auralyne looked toward the palace gardens below. Jonah was there again, speaking with gardeners. Of course he was. She doubted he even knew half the rumors surrounding him. That was one of the things she admired most. He wasn't playing the game. He barely realized there was one. Jonah finally noticed something was wrong during dinner. Not because anyone confronted him. Because no one would sit near him anymore. The grand banquet hall usually buzzed with diplomatic conversation. Tonight, entire tables subtly rearranged themselves. Nobles who had spoken warmly to him days earlier suddenly found reasons to speak elsewhere. One ambassador abruptly remembered another meeting. 2 military officers excused themselves before dessert. Jonah quietly watched it happen. Then looked toward Ambassador Calloway. Did I do something? She sighed. You became politically inconvenient. I fixed a school. You also questioned an empire. I questioned decisions. Governments rarely appreciate the distinction. Jonah rubbed the back of his neck. Oh. Several moments passed. Then, Auralyne crossed the room. Every conversation stopped. She ignored them. Ignored every pair of eyes following her. Ignored every whispered assumption. She simply sat beside Jonah. The silence became almost comical. Jonah leaned closer. I think everyone's staring. They are. You probably shouldn't be sitting here. I know. You'll make things worse. She reached for her glass. They were already worse. Jonah studied her expression. You look tired. I am. I'm sorry. She looked at him. For what? I think I accidentally made your life complicated. Auralyne smiled faintly. You overestimate yourself. I do? My life was complicated long before you arrived. She paused. You merely made me notice it. The orchestra continued playing. No one else spoke loudly enough to interrupt them. For the first time in years, Auralyne stopped caring who was watching. 3 days later, the delegation prepared to leave. The realization hit Auralyne much harder than she expected. She stood on the eastern balcony watching workers load diplomatic cargo aboard the silver Solari vessel. Miri approached quietly. They depart at sunset. I know. You've been standing here for an hour. I know. You could go speak with him. I know. So why haven't you? Auralyne closed her eyes. Because if I do, she couldn't finish. Miri understood anyway. Leaving became real once people said goodbye. As long as she avoided that conversation, some irrational part of her could pretend nothing was ending. Eventually Miri spoke again. Highness. Auralyne looked up. I have known you since you were 4. I know. You've never feared battle. No. You've never feared politics. No. You've never feared standing against your mother. No. Miri smiled gently. But you're terrified of one honest conversation. Auralyne gave a defeated laugh. When did you become so wise? I've simply watched you long enough. She placed a comforting hand on the princess's shoulder. The hardest battles rarely involve swords. Jonah stood alone near the diplomatic landing platform. Most of the cargo had already been loaded. Only a few hours remained before departure. He heard footsteps behind him. I was beginning to think you'd avoid me. Auralyne stopped beside him. I considered it. What changed your mind? Miri. He laughed. I like her. So do I. Neither spoke for several moments. The setting sun painted the clouds gold. Jonah finally broke the silence. I guess this is goodbye. I suppose it is. He looked out toward the horizon. I don't know when, or if, the coalition will send another delegation. Auralyne nodded slowly. I understand. Another silence. Longer this time. Jonah inhaled. I keep trying to think of something important to say. So do I. But everything sounds either too formal. He smiled awkwardly, or completely inadequate. Auralyne looked down at her hands. I've spent years preparing speeches. And? They're useless. Jonah laughed softly. That's comforting. It shouldn't be. No. He turned toward her. You change. She blinked. I don't mean because of me. His voice remained calm. I think you stopped pretending. Auralyne swallowed. You helped. I didn't do anything. You listened. His expression softened. I'll always listen. The words lingered between them. Neither moved. Neither seemed willing to break the moment. Finally Jonah reached into his satchel. I almost forgot. He handed her a small wooden object. She turned it over in her hands. It was carved into the shape of a fox sitting beneath a tree. Simple, handmade, beautiful in its imperfections. I made it during the trip. You carved this? I'm not very good. Auralyne smiled. I disagree. She carefully traced one tiny carved ear with her claw. No one has ever given me something they made themselves. Jonah looked genuinely surprised. Really? Everything I've ever received, she glanced toward the palace, came with expectations. This doesn't. He smiled. It's just a fox. Auralyne looked at the carving again. Then quietly whispered, I think it's much more than that. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from an upper palace balcony. Empress Seraphine. Her expression revealed nothing, but inside, for the first time, she began wondering whether Jonah Vale might not be the greatest threat to the empire. Perhaps the greater threat was the possibility that he truly loved her daughter without wanting anything in return. The departure alarm echoed across the landing district. Low, resonant, impossible to ignore. Jonah slipped the last of his belongings into a storage case and stood near the loading ramp of the Solari shuttle. Around him, engineers performed final systems checks while diplomats exchanged the last polite farewells expected between governments. His attention, however, remained fixed on the palace overlooking the city. He knew she wasn't coming. She had already said goodbye. That should have been enough. It had to be enough. Still hoping? Ambassador Calloway asked quietly as she stepped beside him. Jonah smiled without looking away from the palace. I don't know. You've been staring at that balcony for 15 minutes. I didn't realize. You've become very bad at hiding things. He laughed softly. I've never been good at it. Calloway folded her arms. I've worked with you for nearly 6 years. And, I've never seen you hesitate to leave a mission. Jonah finally looked toward her. This one feels unfinished. The ambassador followed his gaze toward the palace. Careful. About what? Sometimes unfinished stories stay with you longer than completed ones. Before Jonah could answer, movement. A lone figure appeared at the far end of the landing platform. Orange fur, white ceremonial cloak, no guards, no attendants, only Auralyne. She walked toward him with steady determination. The workers politely pretended not to notice. Neither of them spoke until only a few steps separated them. I thought you'd already said goodbye, Jonah admitted. So did I. She looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. I realized something. What? I don't like unfinished conversations. Jonah smiled. I can relate. For several quiet moments they simply stood together while the distant engines warmed behind them. Finally Auralyne spoke. When you first arrived, she said, I thought you would become another name I politely forgot. Ouch. You interrupted ceremonies. I did. You ignored protocol. Frequently. You asked impossible questions. I've been told. She smiled, and somehow, her voice softened. You reminded me that I was still a person. Jonah felt his chest tighten. You did the same for me. She looked surprised. Me? You reminded me that titles don't erase humanity. He hesitated. I'll remember that, so will I. The departure announcement sounded again. Final boarding. Ambassador Calloway gave Jonah an apologetic look before boarding the shuttle with the rest of the delegation. Within moments, only Jonah remained on the platform. Auralyne looked toward the ship. I suppose this is actually goodbye. I suppose it is. Neither moved. Neither wanted to be the first. Finally Jonah laughed quietly. We're really bad at this. We are. He reached into one of his pockets. I forgot something else. Auralyne raised an eyebrow. He produced a small folded piece of paper. Not a datapad. Actual paper. I know your palace probably has scanners that can read this in half a second, he said, but don't. She accepted it carefully. I won't. Read it later. I promise. He stepped backward toward the boarding ramp. Then stopped. Auralyne. She looked up. I'm glad I met you. Her ears lowered slightly. So am I. Another step backward. I mean it. I know. One final step. He turned toward the shuttle. Then stopped again. Spun back around. Walked forward 2 quick steps. Before either of them had time to think, he wrapped her in a brief hug. Gentle. Respectful. Lasting barely 2 seconds. Then he immediately stepped away. I'm sorry. He looked horrified. I should have asked first. Auralyne blinked. The world seemed strangely quiet. No noble had ever hugged her. Not once in her adult life. People bowed. People knelt. People kissed rings. No one embraced her. She slowly smiled. You probably should have. I know. But, she stepped forward once. I'm glad you didn't. Jonah laughed in obvious relief. So am I. This time he boarded the shuttle. He didn't look back. Not because he didn't want to. Because if he did, he wasn't sure he'd be able to leave. Auralyne stood motionless as the vessel lifted into the evening sky. She watched until the silver light disappeared among the stars. Only then did she unfold the small piece of paper in her hand. It contained a single handwritten sentence. Never let them convince you that kindness is weakness. She read it twice, then folded it carefully again. Instead of placing it in a royal archive, she tucked it close to her heart. The palace felt impossibly quiet after the delegation departed. No laughter drifted through the gardens. No unexpected questions echoed through the halls. No human wandered into places diplomats weren't supposed to be. For the first time in weeks, everything returned to normal. Auralyne discovered she hated normal. She wandered through the palace almost absent-mindedly. The school Jonah had helped repair. The market where he had spoken with fishermen. The fountain where they'd first argued. Every place carried a memory now. Eventually Miri found her sitting alone beneath the crystal trees. You miss him? Auralyne didn't answer immediately. I miss. She searched for the words, who I became around him. Miri sat beside her. That's different. I laughed more. You did. I listened better. You did. I stopped pretending. You did. Auralyne looked down at the carved wooden fox Jonah had given her. What if that version of me disappears now that he's gone? Miri smiled warmly. It won't. How can you know? Because he didn't create that version of you. She gently touched the wooden carving. He simply reminded you she was already there. The princess remained silent. The realization settled slowly. Perhaps Miri was right. Perhaps the person Jonah had seen had existed all along, hidden beneath years of duty, years of expectation, years of carefully performed perfection. And perhaps she no longer wished to hide her again. 3 weeks later, everything changed. A secure transmission arrived from the outer system of Dethros. Not to the Empress, not to the Imperial Council, to Princess Auralyne personally. The message came from Governor Elion Thorne, the administrator responsible for the mining colonies. His face appeared tense. Your Highness, he said, we have a situation. Behind him alarms flashed across the command center. The worker strike has expanded. Auralyne's expression hardened. How many settlements? 23. Her stomach tightened. And they're organized. Governor Thorne nodded. They've chosen representatives. Good. They're refusing all negotiations. Why? The governor hesitated, then quietly answered, they don't believe the Empire intends to negotiate honestly. Auralyne closed her eyes. She already knew why. Years of broken promises. Years of ignored petitions. Years of reports buried beneath political convenience. Trust, once lost, was incredibly difficult to rebuild. Then the governor spoke the sentence she had feared most. The military has requested authorization to deploy. Auralyne slowly opened her eyes. Outside her window, the palace remained peaceful. Children laughed in distant gardens. Birds circled the crystal towers. The capital had no idea an entire region of the empire stood on the edge of civil war. Her mind drifted briefly to a small folded note resting safely inside her desk drawer. Never let them convince you that kindness is weakness. She looked back toward the governor. Delay the fleet, Your Highness? I'm coming to dethrone myself. The governor stared. Without the military? Yes. That's dangerous. Auralyne stood. So is sending soldiers before sending hope. Far away, aboard a coalition vessel crossing deep space, Jonah Vale received an emergency transmission from Ambassador Calloway. He read only the first sentence before standing. His expression immediately changed. Princess Auralyne had just volunteered to walk unarmed into the most unstable region of the empire. And if the reports were accurate, there were powerful people on both sides who would rather see peace fail than succeed. For the first time since leaving Velmara Prime, Jonah turned his ship around.